Today's session is Cultivating Student Scientific Habits and Inquiry Skill and Supporting Peers with Feedback. So, as we say, there's our 5 sessions. And again, a reminder, we are going to do an elementary STEM summit in June. Clicker. What is your role? Just have an understanding of who our audience is today. What's your role in education? Are you an education student from the college, a teacher, a principal, an admin, or an other? All right, we'll close that. So we have 75% of our group today is made up of teachers, 2% principal, administrator, and then folks who are representing different agencies and organizations that are associated with schools but may not be directly considered a K-12 type of an organization. That's great. Did you come to the second session of STEM Square last month? How many people in the room? Again, this just helps us in terms of presenting today. How many folks came to the session last month where we were here and we went on some field trips? We hit 50 again. All right, we'll close that out. Good, about half. So about half the folks here were at our STEM session last month, and I think this is the last one. How many have you been to total? So this is the third one. Have you been to all 3? This is my 3rd session, this is my 2nd session, or this is my 1st session? You guys are getting good. That was quick. All right, so about thirds, roughly. 1/3 and 1/4. Yeah, good. Excellent. Very helpful. All right, so just to kind of attach us to the previous sessions. We're not going to watch this again, those of you that were here before. But we wanted to put a few slides together for folks who may not have been here for any of the sessions yet or may have missed a session along the way. Just to kind of replant some things back in your head and put you back in the frame of mind of why we're here and some of the events that we've talked about so far. So last session we had our congressman from our district, Congressman Tierney. He had videotaped some remarks from D.C. He has been very supportive of our endeavor with STEM Squared. We actually had a meeting with him about 6-7 weeks ago and maybe about 5-6 weeks ago. And he was very, very supportive about the idea of helping to promote STEM instruction and STEM thinking and inquiry-based thinking and practices and processes at the elementary level. He was very intrigued by that. And he taped a welcome message for us down in D.C. Out of his office, and we were able to show that message last time. So there's this sort of federal understanding of why this is important. And for those of you that have been here for the other sessions, you can kind of see that we've grown a little bit in size, which is nice too. The audience has continued to grow with each session. We also talked in one of our first sessions about at the state level, STEM is very, very important agenda item, I guess you could say. It's talked about quite a bit. As you know, we've got the Governor's STEM Council, and we have the regional STEM networks all around the state. And the activity around STEM, there's a new STEM plan. We talked about that. I think you got a copy of that new STEM plan, the statewide STEM plan, where there are 5 state STEM goals. And so the chatter around STEM is constant, and it's everywhere. And so, again, I praise you for taking the time to be at sessions like this today, because you're going to be that much further ahead of the game, because it's a local conversation, it's a regional conversation, it's a state conversation, it's a federal, national conversation, and it's actually a sort of a worldwide conversation. Everyone's having these conversations around the importance of STEM instruction and thinking in a manner that you use practices and processes in your thinking, and that's something that we're going to talk a little bit further about today. So we spent some time on that in the first session. Also, we met Kane. How many of you remember Kane? Yes, our friend Kane. Love Kane. We'll come back to Kane again today a little bit. There's not another video, but there's a really cool thing that has to do with a vomit bag on a plane, which is, you wouldn't think that has anything to do with STEM, but it does. And I'm going to explain to you later what a vomit bag on a plane has to do with STEM instruction. But for those of you who haven't met Kane, Kane is a young boy out of LA, East LA. And there's a video called Kane's Arcade. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I strongly suggest you YouTube it or Google it, or whatever the case may be.
There's a link on stemsquared.org.
Perfect. Yeah, actually on that stemsquared.org page, there's a resource section. And all the stuff, all the PowerPoints, and all the stuff that we've talked about, all the trainings, all the materials, all the videos, it's all up on STEM Squared. So if you ever want to use any of this stuff back in your district, feel free to do that. But as you remember, Kane was a naturally curious student, and he built an entire arcade out of cardboard. And I think I remember saying this before. My favorite part of the video is when he feeds the tickets out. He crawls into a little machine and feeds those tickets out. He's a boy with much ingenuity and creativity and higher order thinking. So again, just trying to plant some slides back into your head of what we talked about before. This has been another thread that we've woven through all of these sessions, is the importance of higher order thinking. You know, Bloom had it right in the 1950s when he sort of developed this taxonomy of learning and thinking. And as we've talked about in the past, you have your lower order thinking skills, which is the remembering, understanding, and applying. And our whole notion, the seeds of higher order thinking are sown really well in the STEM subjects. Science, technology, engineering, and math really lend themselves to this notion of higher order thinking where kids are creating, evaluating, and analyzing. And we think back to Kane. Kane was doing just that. He was creating, he was analyzing, he was evaluating what he was doing. And, you know, sort of Kane's world has blown up as a result of that gentleman going in to buy the hubcap that day. And he happened to be a documentary filmmaker, and his whole world has sort of changed as a result of his interest in STEM. So again, just planting us back and grounding our feet back into what we've kind of talked about so far. So another clicker question for you. So that's sort of the past, right? So now we want to talk about today. You know, we had a title for today's presentation. And within this, what are you most looking forward to hearing about today during this meeting? Sort of the secret recipe of STEM, like how do I do this, and what's the real practical way to approach this? How do we get better STEM results? Best practices for instructional design, best practices for inquiry methods, best practices for implementation, or effective peer-to-peer coaching. So of that list, so I guess it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or A, B, C, D, E, F. So 1 would be the top, 2 would be the second one, 3 would be the third, 4 would be the fourth, fifth, and then 6th on your clickers.
I'll take responsibility for that. I was the guy that didn't keep the numbers.
All right, I think we're there. Polling, 53. All right, so let's take a look. The secret recipe, how we get better STEM results. So it looks like best practices, 30%, best practices for inquiry, 43, best practices for implementation, and that makes perfect sense to me. You know, we've talked about all the stuff sort of up here, and now it's like, how do I bring it to my classroom? How do I do this, right? How do we make this all work? And that's something that we'll talk about today. It's interesting, as Francis and I were going through the slideshow this morning and a little bit yesterday afternoon, there's a slide towards the end of the presentation. I said to Francis, you know what's great about this slide? And it's got all the things on there that are going to be really helpful for you to implement. I said, not one thing on there costs a dime. It doesn't cost a dime. Nothing. And that was exciting to me. So it's not like you need to go out and do this and get that and do this and do that. All the things on this list that we're going to show you later that will help with implementation cost nothing. I sound like an info commercial that should be on at 11:30 at night. $49.99. All right, turn and talk. So these are just the people who are right in your general area, 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, turn back, turn left, turn right, find a friend. What excites you most about walking into your school if you're a principal or administrator, or your classroom if you're a teacher, or however you want to view this question? But what excites you the most about walking into your school or classroom every single day? Take a couple minutes and turn and talk. All right, we'll stop you there. Let's have a couple of folks just volunteer and share an answer. What excites you most about walking in your school classroom every single day? Yes. It's naturally and it's innate, and it's every single day. It's like a endless supply. It's remarkable, isn't it? It really is. It's just that the curiosity and the wonder is just in an endless supply. They have it, which is great. Agreed. Yes. Did someone have a hand up over here? Yeah. And I'll extend that analogy a little bit more and say, there are some sponges that come in with the plastic still on, and you have to find a way to get that plastic off, right? Because they come in with some sort of defenses up or some sort of a life history or whatever the case may be, and an LD, absolutely, and you've got to kind of get the plastic off to even before you even can think about filling the sponge, so to speak. So I think that is a very, very good analogy. I think too about, as a fifth grade teacher, when I was a fifth grade teacher, I taught in Salem at the Bentley when I started my career, and to me that was it was a great part of teaching and it was a frustrating part of teaching, because the great part was the light bulb would go on and then you'd be like, I'm the only adult in the room. You had no one to high five. You're like, oh my God, this is so great. In football they get to belly blast each other after they tackle somebody, and in teaching it's just like you have this great moment, there's just no one there to share it with. It can be frustrating sometimes. A couple more, because we need to kind of move a little bit quickly. Yes?
For me, it's open doors. That's what excites me. And working with my other teaching partner and having interdisciplinary opportunities for extending our learning outside of the classroom.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with you. And those collegial conversations, those peer conversations, and the open door is a huge part of what we do, and I think it's a crucial part of what we do because we need that support when the positive happens and when the negative happens. So I couldn't agree with you more. One final one. Just because I like 5. Anyone? I will pick on you. I promise. Yes, tell us what's on your mind. You look like you were about to say something.
We were talking about just the new technology in the classroom just open up.
Huge.
For kids that were difficult to reach before, really exciting just like really bring them out of the.
Absolutely. And engage. Yes. Good. Very good. I'm thinking I'm clicking here without knowing it. All right. So now, sort of a little bit of the opposite. And a little bit of the opposite is, come on. There we go. Given that education is your journey, right? What's the stone in your shoe, right? So we talked about what you like. What's the stone in your shoe? What's the thing that as you teach every day, you're kind of like, oh man, you kidding me? I've got to do this. This is a turn and talk, and we'll do a quick regroup afterwards.
You got people shouting out now.
I know, exactly. Don't throw the stones at us, please. Keep them in your shoe, but do a quick turn and talk. What's the stone in your shoe, so to speak, metaphorically?
Okay, so if you wouldn't mind, if a few folks would be willing to share, what is the stone in your shoe? Yes? Time. I heard someone else say schedule a bit earlier. Time, schedule.
Time.
What else? Time taken out of the classroom. So students leaving for something. Teachers being out of the classroom. Being pulled out of the classroom for different admin-related things. Paperwork, yeah.
Everything that's not instruction.
Everything that isn't instruction.
Which is becoming more and more. I think that's the problem.
Unfortunately, it is, isn't it? It's. I remember when it was the occasional IEP meeting. Yeah.
Especially the feeling of being rushed all the time, not having, it's time, but it's also the pressure. Too many things. Everything, you teach everything in the time that you have, but it's too many things.
Right. In all the years, the only thing that's remained constant is the amount of time you have. But the standards have increased, the testing has increased, the paperwork has increased, the admin, the evaluation, all these things have increased, but the time has remained the same.
In my group, we also talked about the testing and how much time that takes away from the joy of learning.
Yes. The amount of time given to testing. It's interesting. I recently was looking at all the different tests, and realize that when you add up, in certain grades, when you add up all of the different testing days, that it's something on the order of 1 out of every 10 school days is spent in some sort of standardized test, which, when you consider the length of the school year, that is quite something.
But I think the nature of some of that testing also, because it's inauthentic and kids won't get it,
Right.
even when they know the knowledge, it's like then you have to teach them about how the test works, which is more than that 1 every 10 days.
Right, exactly. So there's an element of it's understanding the purpose of the test,
And learning how it works.
the type of language, how the test works, why we're taking it.
Which is what makes third grade such a transitional year. You have to teach the kids how to take a test.
Right. And if you do the math out of a 9-month school year, you're basically spending at least a month purely in testing when you kind of do the math out. And then if you're having to spend this extra time, more than a month. Yeah.
So maybe just ask this question. So like when you think of that metaphor of a stone in your shoe, does it literally feel that way every single day? Like you just, like when you have a stone in your shoe, you know it's there. You kind of shake it and you try to move it around. But at the end of the day, is it just sort of always present? All these sort of things on the list? Yeah? Yeah, that's how I would agree.
This is where you have no shoes. Yeah.
Right.
I wanted to extend what the woman in the front was talking about as far as knowing about things. And one of the things that was triggered when she was talking was the fact that a lot of my students seem to know about, but don't understand. And I think given our curriculum and what we're expected to do as teachers, cover, what ends up happening is so many kids leave just knowing about it. They're not able to explain, they're not able to analyze, they're not able to create or evaluate because they just know what the answer is, but they don't know why. Like for instance,
Right.
like gas in a car. You know, why does the car run? I know I need to put gas in it. I know
Right.
that, but I don't have any understanding other than that.
Right, and so that comes back to the practices and the processes, because if we're teaching STEM content or any content and we're not anchoring it in the practices of where it comes from or how it's developed and the process for doing that, then all we leave with is knowing some facts, which might work on a test, but it doesn't necessarily prepare you for college or for career. And what's interesting is actually the Mass Business Roundtable did a big survey recently of some 400 large employers in Massachusetts, many of them, if not most of them, STEM employers. And they said, our schools, what is the grade you think they gave our schools, this group, more or less? Actually, they gave our schools a B. A B. They said, what do you think of our schools here in Massachusetts? And they said, B. Then they asked a question, and they said, how are our schools preparing students for jobs at your company? What kind of a job are they doing with that college and career readiness piece? What do you think they said there? D.
Such a disconnect.
So I don't think that we're really on a different page than the industry. I think what we have is a system issue, right? And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. And we're going to see. And as you go to these site visits today, and I hope, depending on where you were last time you went to see a site visit, everybody got a bit of a different experience. You're going to have a different experience today. These things aren't luxury. This isn't a luxury. This isn't an optional field trip kind of thing. What this is this is an opportunity for you to see what you're teaching in your classroom, why it matters, how it's being used today. And a lot of the practices and processes are actually things that these companies are using and doing. And the way that they're creating better products, the way that they compete with other companies is simply by getting better processes. And the system of education really needs better processes. And the reality is that it starts at our level, and we can kind of help inform that. But things to keep in mind. Anything else anybody wanted to share on this topic? Stone. Anybody have a different stone we didn't share? No? Interruptions. Yeah. Yes. I remember sitting in on a lesson for a teacher. And she happened to be the cluster leader. And for whatever reason, the schools would talk about systems, better results through better process. The process in this school was if someone needed to find a student in that cluster, they called the cluster leader, and the cluster leader would tell them where the student was. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness, you want to talk about interruptions? This poor teacher was so excited about her lesson, and just as she would get going and the kids would get settled down, the phone would ring. And then the kids would all go crazy, and then she'd get off the phone, get them back together, and then over and over and over again. So wonder, this person, you could just feel the stress. I saw another hand over here. Yes?
That money is a driver too. So there's a lot of, because we couldn't cover each other's classes because we didn't have money for stuff.
Right.
So money is a problem.
Right.
It's not-
Yep, resources, huge. 1, 2, and we'll go on. Yes? Lack of things. Working technology. Technology is great when it works, right? But when it's not compatible or when it breaks, and who do you call to fix it? Exact example of process. I remember being a first-year teacher, and we didn't have smartboards. I didn't know anybody with a smartboard. We had overhead projectors, and my bulb went out. But you know what? I had no clue who to call. I had no clue where to get a light bulb. And nobody else knew where to get a light bulb either. I think I ended up going on like Amazon and buying one and fixing it myself, right? How many people have done that before? Simple process. There was somebody whose job it was to take care of these things. If I knew who to call, I could have solved the problem and I could have addressed the issue, but instead it just sat there and somebody else is probably still using that broken projector today. Last one up there.
I think fear of imagination, because that still don't take the time to create or imagine.
Yeah.
They're so used to adults telling them what to do, how to do it, when to do it by,
Right.
and if it's wrong, not, oh, I like the way you thought of that. It's so cut and dry.
Right. And that comes right back to this here, if my clicker will respond. You know, we talk about the testing. We spend a whole month of our year testing, which is a lot of remembering, understanding, applying. And you can kind of get really steeped in that. But how much of it is creating, evaluating, and analyzing? I think that's pretty debatable. And so almost that creating, evaluating, analyzing is that adventurous learning, which I think starts to permeate, and sometimes we can lose focus. So,
Stay on that slide for 1 second.
yep.
Just want to, what's your name? Jody. And what's your role?
I'm a first grade teacher.
Okay. So I couldn't agree with you more. And I've been hypothesizing in my head lately that as I think about this whole notion of higher order thinking, right? And I think about, we keep saying to our teachers, we need to get our kids to think at a higher level, we need to get our kids to think, and we do. It's very, very important. And as I think about this, and I think about sort of the state of education that we're in today, I think we need higher order leadership, right? I think we need to engage our teachers at a higher order level. I think leadership right now is too often caught in lower order thinking. I think a lot of leadership is remembering, understanding, applying, and comply with all these things that are happening at the state and federal level. Check the box, check the box, check the box, right? And I think it's incumbent upon us as leaders, right, in my role as a director of a curriculum, and if someone's a principal, if someone's a superintendent, whatever the role is, a leadership role. And as teachers, you have leadership roles. You're the leader of your classroom. So if we expect it of you, I think from a leadership perspective, we need to expect it of ourselves and make sure that, yes, we do have to live sometimes down to the lower order leadership level, but we also need to have higher order leadership and engage our teachers in a manner in which we're accessing their creativity, their ability to evaluate, analyze, synthesize, and do all those things. Because when you're engaged, you're going to be that much more apt to want to run into that classroom and engage those kids. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
And that's
good.
key in terms of you're interested in implementation. That's huge. If we're trying to implement things by just an authoritative, you do it, right, mandate, that happens a lot. It does. It's the wrong message. It's not the way to be effective. So anyway, so we've got a good list going anyhow. So before we go on to a short video here for you, want to take a clicker question. Do you directly affect what excites you most about education? So effect being control. Do you directly control what excites you most about education, about teaching? So something that you don't affect is the test, right? You got to do it. It's there. I'm sorry, what's that?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe. No maybes. The numbers may be growing a little bit. We have close to 70 people
Would you mind?
signed up, but some people had a little bit of traffic getting in. Another couple seconds. Do you directly affect what excites you most about teaching? And folks say yes. 75-25, yes. Very interesting. I'm sorry, what's that? Okay, so let's see here. We're coming up to our kind of first secret. I'll let you segue this while we're...
Okay, so we found this video that ties into all these things that we're talking about. If you've never met Sean Aker before, Sean Aker is going to talk to you a little bit about happiness. He talks very fast, okay? Very fast. He's very funny, and it's almost like, you know when you type in a computer, and then you look up, and then sometimes the letters come into play, right? When I watched this video the first time, it was sort of like that in my brain. I was like, oh, yeah, that was pretty good. And then he's already on to something else, right? So he does talk quickly. I had actually watched it a few times. And so what we did was we pulled some things out of his thing. So if you miss stuff, we'll kind of review and talk about it afterwards. But this ties into the rock in your shoe, what excites you, and this is all going to lead towards, you guys talked about implementation. I said to Francis, we need to get down to the practical level now. We've been talking about these worldly things, but we need to bring it down, practical level, what can we do? This is a very much a what we can do in education for teachers, for kids, for administrators, all up and down the ladder. So this is one piece of it, okay? So this is Sean Aker.
When I was 7 years old and my sister was just 5 years old, we were playing on top of a bunk bed. I was 2 years older than my sister at the time. I mean, I'm 2 years older than her now, but at the time that meant she had to do everything that I wanted to do, and I wanted to play war. So we were up on top of our bunk beds, and on one side of the bunk bed I had put out all my G.I. Joe soldiers and weaponry, and on the other side were all my sister's Milos and ponies and ready for a cavalry charge. There are differing accounts of what actually happened that afternoon, but since my sister is not here with us today, let me tell you the true story. Which is my sister is a little bit on the clumsy side, and somehow, without any help or push from her older brother at all, suddenly Amy disappeared off of the top of the bunk bed and landed with us crash on the floor. And I nervously peered over the side of the bed to see what had befallen my fallen sister, and saw that she had landed painfully on her hands and knees on all fours on the ground. I was nervous because my parents had charged me with making sure that my sister and I played as safely and as quietly as possible. And seeing as how I had accidentally broken Amy's arm just 1 week before, heroically pushing her out of the way of an oncoming imaginary sniper bullet, for which I have yet to be thanked. I was trying as hard as I could. She didn't even see it coming. I was trying as hard as I could to be on my best behavior, and I saw my sister's face this wail of pain and suffering and surprise, threatening to erupt from her mouth and threatening to wake my parents from the long winter's nap for which they had settled. So I did the only thing my little frantic 7-year-old brain could think to do to avert this tragedy. If you have children, you've seen this hundreds of times before. I said, Amy, wait, don't cry, don't cry. Did you see how you landed? No human lands on all fours like that. Amy, I think this means you're a unicorn. Now that was cheating because there's nothing in the world my sister would want more than not to be Amy the hurt 5-year-old little sister, but Amy the special unicorn. Of course, this was an option that was open to her brain at no point in the past. And you could see on my poor, manipulated sister's face conflict, as her little brain attempted to devote resources to feeling the pain and suffering surprise she just experienced, or contemplating her newfound identity as a unicorn. And the latter won out. Instead of crying, instead of ceasing our play, instead of waking my parents with all the negative consequences that would have ensued for me, instead, a smile spread across her face, and she scrambled right back up onto the bunk bed with all the grace of a baby unicorn. With one broken leg. What we stumbled across at this tender age of just 5 and 7, we had no idea at the time, was something that was going to be at the vanguard of a scientific revolution occurring 2 decades later in the way that we look at the human brain. What we had stumbled across is something called positive psychology, which is the reason that I'm here today and the reason that I wake up every morning. When I first started talking about this research outside of academia, out with companies and schools, the very first thing they said to never do is to start your talk with a graph. The very first thing I wanted to do is start my talk with a graph. This graph looks boring, but this graph is the reason that I get excited and wake up every morning. And this graph doesn't even mean anything. It's fake data. What we found is if I got this data back studying you here in the room, I would be thrilled because there's very clearly a trend that's going on there, and that means that I can get published, which is all that really matters. The fact that there's one weird red dot that's up above the curve, there's one weird in the room, you know who you are, I saw you earlier. That's no problem. That's no problem, as most of you know, because I can just delete that dot. I can delete that dot because that's clearly a measurement error, and we know that's a measurement error because it's messing up my data. So one of the very first things that we teach people in economics and statistics and business and psychology courses is how, in a statistically valid way, do we eliminate the weirdos? How do we eliminate the outliers? So that we can find the line of best fit, which is fantastic if I'm trying to find out how many Advil the average person should be taking, too. But if I'm interested in potential, if I'm interested in your potential, or for happiness, or productivity, or energy, or creativity, what we're doing is we're creating the cult of the average with science. If I ask a question like, how fast can a child learn how to read in a classroom? Scientists change the answer to, how fast does the average child learn how to read in that classroom? And then we tailor the class right towards the average. Now, if you fall below the average on this curve, then psychologists get thrilled, because that means you're either depressed, or you have a disorder, or hopefully both. We're hoping for both because our business model is if you come into a therapy session with one problem, we want to make sure you leave knowing you have 10. So you'll keep coming back over and over again. We'll go back into your childhood if necessary, but eventually what we want to do is to make you normal again. But normal is merely average. And what I posit, and what positive psychology posits, is that if we study what is merely average, we will remain merely average. That instead of deleting those positive outliers, what I intentionally do is come into a population like this one and says, why? Why is it that some of you are so high above the curve in terms of your intellectual ability, athletic ability, musical ability, creativity, energy levels, your resiliency in the face of challenge, your sense of humor? Whatever it is, instead of deleting you, what I want to do is study you. Because maybe we can glean information, not just how to move people up to the average, but how we can move the entire average up at our companies and schools worldwide. The reason this graph is important to me is when I turn on the news, it seems like the majority of the information is not positive. In fact, it's negative. Most of it's about murder, corruption, diseases, natural disasters, and very quickly, my brain starts to think that's the accurate ratio of negative to positive in the world. What that's doing is creating something called the medical school syndrome, which if you know people who have been to medical school during the first year of medical training, as you read through a list of all the symptoms and diseases that could happen, suddenly you realize you have all of them. I have a brother-in-law named Bobo, which is a whole other story. Bobo married Amy the unicorn. Bobo called me on the phone from Yale Medical School. And Bobo said, Sean, I have leprosy. Which even at Yale is extraordinarily rare. But I had no idea how to console poor Bobo because he had just gotten over an entire week of menopause. See, what we're finding is not necessarily the reality that shapes us, but the lens through which your brain views the world that shapes your reality. And if we can change the lens, not only can we change your happiness, we can change every single educational and business outcome at the same time. When I applied to Harvard, I applied on a dare. I didn't expect to get in, and my family had no money for college. When I got a military scholarship 2 weeks later that allowed me to go, suddenly something that wasn't even a possibility became a reality. When I went there, I assumed everyone else would see it as a privilege as well, that they'd be excited to be there. Even if you're in a classroom full of people smarter than you, you'd be happy just to be in that classroom, which is what I felt. But what I found there is while some people experienced that, when I graduated after my 4 years and then spent the next 8 years living in the dorms with the students, Harvard asked me to. I wasn't that guy. But what happened... I was an officer of Harvard to counsel students through the difficult 4 years, and what I found in my research and my teaching is that these students, no matter how happy they were with their original success of getting into the school, 2 weeks later, their brains were focused not on the privilege of being there, nor on their philosophy or their physics. Their brain was focused on the competition, the workload, the hassles, the stresses, the complaints. When I first went in there, I walked into the freshman dining hall, which is where my friends from Waco, Texas, which is where I grew up, I know some of you have heard of it. When they come to visit me, they look around, they say, this freshman dining hall looks like something out of Hogwarts from the movie Harry Potter, which it does. This is Hogwarts from the movie Harry Potter, and that's Harvard. And when they see this, they say, Sean, why do you waste your time studying happiness at Harvard? Seriously, what does a Harvard student possibly have to be unhappy about? Embedded within that question is the key to understanding the science of happiness. Because what that question assumes is that our external world is predictive of our happiness levels. When in reality, if I know everything about your external world, I can only predict 10% of your long-term happiness. 90% of your long-term happiness is predicted not by the external world, but by the way your brain processes the world. And if we change it, if we change our formula for happiness and success, what we can do is change the way that we can then affect reality. What we found is that only 25% of job successes are predicted by IQ. 75% of job successes are predicted by your optimism levels, your social support, and your ability to see stress as a challenge instead of as a threat. I talked to a boarding school up in New England, probably the most prestigious boarding school, and they said, we already know that. So every year, instead of just teaching our students, we also have a wellness week, and we're so excited. Monday night, we have the world's leading expert coming in to speak about adolescent depression. Tuesday night is school violence and bullying. Wednesday night's eating disorders. Thursday night is illicit drug use. And Friday night, we're trying to decide between risky sex or happiness. I said that's most people's Friday nights. Which I'm glad you liked, but they did not like that at all. Silence on the phone. And into the silence, I said, I'd be happy to speak at your school, but just so you know, that's not a wellness week, that's a sickness week. What you've done is you've outlined all the negative things that can happen, but not talked about the positive. The absence of disease is not health. Here's how we get to health. We need to reverse the formula for happiness and success. In the past 3 years, I've traveled to 45 different countries, working with schools and companies in the midst of an economic downturn. And what I found is that most companies and schools follow a formula for success, which is this: if I work harder, I'll be more successful. And if I'm more successful, then I'll be happier. That undergirds most of our parenting styles, our managing styles, the way that we motivate our behavior. And the problem is, it's scientifically broken and backwards for 2 reasons. First, every time your brain has a success, you just change the goalpost of what success looked like. You got good grades, now you have to get better grades. You got into a good school, now you have to get a better school. You got a good job, now you have to get a better job. You hit your sales target, we're going to change your sales target. And if happiness is on the opposite side of success, your brain never gets there. What we've done is we've pushed happiness over the cognitive horizon as a society. And that's because we think we have to be successful, then we'll be happier. But the real problem is our brains work in the opposite order. If you can raise somebody's level of positivity in the present, then their brain experiences what we now call a happiness advantage, which is your brain at positive performs significantly better than it does at negative, neutral, or stressed. Your intelligence rises, your creativity rises, your energy levels rise. In fact, what we found is that every single business outcome improves. Your brain at positive is 31% more productive than your brain at negative, neutral, or stressed. You're 37% better at sales. Doctors are 19% faster, more accurate at coming up with the correct diagnosis when positive instead of negative, neutral, or stressed, which means we can reverse the formula. If we can find a way of becoming positive in the present, then our brains work even more successfully, as we're able to work harder, faster, and more intelligently. What we need to be able to do is to reverse this formula so we can start to see what our brains are actually capable of. Because dopamine, which floods into your system when you're positive, has 2 functions. Not only does it make you happier, it turns on all the learning centers in your brain, allowing you to adapt to the world in a different way. We've found that there are ways that you can train your brain to be able to become more positive. In just a 2-minute span of time, done for 21 days in a row, we can actually rewire your brain, allowing your brain to actually work more optimistically and more successfully. We've done these things in research now in every single company that I've worked with, getting them to write down 3 new things that they're grateful for 21 days in a row, 3 new things each day. And at the end of that, their brain starts to retain a pattern of scanning the world not for the negative, but for the positive first. Journaling about 1 positive experience you've had over the past 24 hours allows your brain to relive it. Exercise teaches your brain that your behavior matters. We find that meditation allows your brain to get over the cultural ADHD that we've been creating by trying to do multiple tasks at once, and allows our brains to focus on the task at hand. And finally, random acts of kindness or conscious acts of kindness. We get people, when they open up their inbox, to write one positive email praising or thanking somebody in their social support network. And by doing these activities and by training your brain, just like we train our bodies, what we found is we can reverse the formula for happiness and success, and in doing so, not only create ripples of positivity, but create a real revolution. Thank you very much.
All right, so does Sean's research hold a message for us? Does the message that he just talked about in terms of the happiness advantage, does that hold a message for us as educators? And if so, what was it that you talked about? So let's have some folks share out. I tell the new teachers in our district, I run the mentoring and that whole thing in our district, and I tell the new teachers that next to air traffic controllers, teachers make the second most decisions, right? Which explains why when you get home at the end of the day and your significant other says, what do you want for dinner? Yeah, I don't care. I've made literally 1,000 decisions today, so yes, eggs and cereal sound delicious for dinner. I am totally on board. Just put a little cheese on the scrambled, I'll be good, right? And when you think about it, it is nonstop decision making, because even as you're making conscious decisions of, it's 11:05, I've got maybe 15 minutes left in the math class, you're also scanning the crowd. Can I go to the bathroom? No, I got to bring that one. That's a decision you made. You're making unconscious and conscious running decisions constantly. And it's literally like after air traffic controllers, it's number 2. So you're right. There is that sort of, there's never that time for you to engage in some of those things. Yeah. I think when I watch this video and just events that have kind of happened in our school district over the past, couple of weeks or so, you think about how valuable in life is, right? And how important it is, the work that we do every single day. And it's important, but it's also important that happiness comes into play, because I think oftentimes we do push happiness past success, and it's always about the next. If I can just get to this thing, then I'll be at a good spot with the kids. If I can just get to this, once I get past the MCAS test, everything will be great in my classroom, And I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that in the present moment, yes, we have all this other stuff kind of running over here, right? And it's the what we have to do, but the how we have to do it, it can be dictated by us. We can determine the how. We can decide the how. They, state, federal, administrators, whoever, they keep telling us the what. You have to do this, you have to do this. But you get to figure out the how. And so within that how, you have a great amount of control and a great amount of autonomy within your classroom. And so if we can build happiness into that how and figure out ways to get to where we need to get in maybe a different manner, and that's something we'll talk about today, then that's going to be putting maybe happiness before success. Francis?
Yeah, and I was really glad that a couple people pulled out that this isn't just for teachers, this is actually for students too. Right? Because not only do you get an advantage as a teacher when you're teaching to what makes you happiest and the reason why you're in this profession to start with, but it's the same thing with the kids. When they come to school every day, yeah, they're there, they have to be there, but they're in it for a bunch of different reasons too, and we can give them that happiness advantage by engaging them in those sort of practices, and we're going to come up on those in a second. But we come up with these kind of 2 dilemmas. Okay, dilemma number 1, what excites you about teaching should be your goal for success. And I think that from what we heard, that's what excites you about teaching. They're very positive things. But we have to keep in mind, and this is what I think some people are talking about, when we have to let go of some stuff, we're programmed to think that if you work harder, you will be more successful, and then you will be happy. This formula is scientifically broken and backwards. This is a quote from the video. It doesn't mean, I see this a lot of times in STEM especially, because there's so much materials involved, so much setup involved. Does it mean that you have to stay after school every day until midnight, getting ready for the next day? Maybe you think so, but it doesn't have to be that way. And so if what excites you is having the students engaged in a part of the learning and a part of the lessons and looking forward to things, can you involve them in doing that? Can you share that with them? Because that's what gets them excited, being able to actually be actively doing things. Okay? When you change the lens, you can change your happiness. This can help us to change educational outcomes and business outcomes. What you're going to see at companies today is all these things. and we're going to come up on a bunch of others here really quickly. When you change your lens, maybe from a happiness perspective, but it's also in how you view the problems, okay? How you view the problem of testing, how you view the problem of the $500,000 deficit, how you view the... And you know what's really interesting in my real job, part of what I do is work with foundations, and I remember when I worked with one of these foundations, I saw the things that they were investing in, and I just thought, oh, what a disaster. You know, tons of money in, not anything much out. And we were talking about something at one point, and the foundation had said, well, we know we pour a lot in and we don't get much out. But what we believe is if we invest in a teacher and we can train a teacher, that teacher, no matter what district or what school they're a part of, they're probably going to be a teacher someplace, somewhere, for the rest of their lives. So we've made a really huge improvement here, just for whatever we can get out. And so that was a big lens correction for me. I thought, I was thinking about the particular school. I was thinking about the particular district. I wasn't thinking about the people who are going to continue to do what excites them, to continue working, dealing with battles, and one way or another be helping children somewhere, anywhere. So that's one piece. The other piece, though, is are you teaching to accommodate the stone in your shoe? That's kind of the negative side, right? And kind of think about it. Somebody wrote this book. It was not published, but like a little piece. And they talked about this person who had a stone in their shoe, and they went on a journey, and they walked and walked and walked and walked, and eventually they became the stone in their shoe. And that's kind of what this is all about. So you want to know about implementation, you want to know about lesson design. If you're designing your lessons, and your lessons involve MCAS prep, that's this here. You're teaching to accommodate the stone in your shoe. That's how you become the stone. Okay? When you look at those sort of happiness pieces, if that's not part of what your lessons involve, you're already giving up 30% right there, right? You're stressing yourself out. You might be stressing the kids out. Really important. And then implementation, what's the likelihood that it's going to succeed? Much less. So key points here. We talked about these, so I don't want to go over it too much. Does that make sense? Does that resonate with anybody? Do you know people like this? Have you seen this?
I was going to say, it goes to the conversation we had about, like, you can't take that risk to go, like...
Yes, risk-taking.
We're a district that performs well, so it's like, if you take that risk and do something different, and it affects the test scores, and then, oh my gosh, everybody's going to freak out, and property value is going to go down, and the
Right.
town's going to revolt against you. So we were talking about, like, what do you do? Like, can you take that risk and hope that it works, or can you not? And that was...
Right. Right.
And we're going to talk about that in a second.
Yeah.
So what we have to do, where we're coming from on this, secret number one is happiness matters. So for implementation, for lesson planning, for all these things, the happiness of the students and the teachers matter. And you have to view, you're going to have problems all the way along. The system's going to keep throwing things at you. A lot of them are going to fade away. All right, some of them are going to stick. There's going to be more paperwork to do. But if it just becomes about meeting the demands, right, you're never going to get anything more than just that.
And it sounds soft and squishy, and let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. It sounds that way.
Yeah, like psychobabble, right? Oh,
right?
yeah,
But it's
motivational
not.
speaking.
It's true. It is 150% true. I mean, I can tell you from my experience as a teacher, my experience as a principal, and experience that I'm in the role now, happiness is a huge, huge predictor of your success. It's the opposite. It's not success is a huge predictor of happiness. The happiness is the predictor of success. I often feel, and I felt this way regardless of the role that I've been in, if we can build an environment and a culture in a place where people feel safe, happy, and supported, all the other stuff tends to take care of itself. And that doesn't mean that there's not going to be stuff that you have to deal with and little issues and problems along the way. But for the most part, those other things will take care of themselves. And you want to feel supported in the work that you do, and you want to know that there are people there supporting you, your colleagues, administrative support, whatever the case may be. So, sometimes people have a reaction to this that it sounds like soft and squishy, and it's not. I can't stress to you enough how crucially important that is in terms of like secret number one in terms of implementation. You guys identified as implementation as like the one thing you hope to get out of this today. Think about happiness when you think about implementing.
And I love that image. Not I don't love the image, but I can identify with the image of that break room.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I remember that, the place everybody goes to talk about what just happened, right? I think about it, it's like a breeding ground for burnout and for these sort of things. Like, how much of that can you really take and actually get somewhere? Okay? Got to reverse the formula. Do we have time for this? Mm-mm. We're going to skip over this. But something to think about. How do we scale the happiness advantage to our schools and our classrooms? So thinking about those pockets where it's not happening, how do we reverse
Just going to jump this slide because of time.
Yep.
But just give that some thought.
The lens makes a difference. So going back to what makes you happiest about teaching, is it internal or external? So if it's external, it's something like the test. It's something you're given. You have no choice. 10 days a year, 18 days a year, you have to do all this testing. Fine. But internal things are things like, how do you deliver that content? Do you choose to make it something that students have ownership over, or do you choose to make it something that you have to have ownership over? And what does that say about two different things? One, the schedule makes a difference. Are we teaching to accommodate the schedule, or are we teaching to accommodate the learning? Because when the students do it, we know it's more effective. When the teacher does it, we know they learn the content, but they don't learn this practice, they don't learn the process. Okay? Other big questions. Do you believe it's achievable? So, implementation, lesson planning, all these things, you have to push the envelope. There are things that you have to have faith in the kids, but you also have to believe that whatever you're doing is achievable. The worst thing, and you've maybe heard this before, people say, you can't do it all. I'll never forget, a district administrator said that to me once, and I thought, oh my goodness. We have already lost, because we can't do it all, and then whatever we have to do, whatever's left, our default position is we can't do it all, so I'm left with less, and we can't do it all, and I'm left with less. And I'll never forget, there was one school that comes to mind in particular, and there was a change of principal. Everybody else had been there. Principal changed. Principal had that attitude. That was the number one most visible change to me. And guess what happened? STEM specifically, their scores fell about 15 points that year. Just because everybody took that on right from leadership, and you could feel it. Okay? They didn't believe it was achievable because of the kind of kids they had. And then just pulling this back from the video, how do we reprogram our lens? These sort of things. Okay? There's a list in your packet. You can see them.
I like that idea, and even with kids, I like this idea. When he talked about scanning, that really resonated with me when he talked about that.
Scan for the positive.
You scan for the positive. So he said, identify 3 things you're thankful for, or gratuities, or whatever the case may be. But I think oftentimes we scan for the negative because we're so programmed to scan for the negative. And you almost have to reprogram your brain. We're constantly bombarded. If we go to Boston.com right now, I guarantee you the first 5 stories are going to be some horrible thing that happened somewhere in the world. And so we need to flip the script on that and help our kids scan for the positive, but I think we also need to scan for the positive.
Okay. So just right now, if you look at this list, so one thing you might have encountered is probably something on this list, not necessarily yourself, maybe a colleague, maybe somebody you're working with, coaching. Can you find the positive opportunity here? What's the positive? Can you reframe any one of these? They can all be reframed, so no tricks.
And the blank could be anything. You can fill anything in the blank.
You can think STEM. The circuit doesn't work. I don't have the background yet. Yeah, yeah. So who wants to, think about it for, yep.
For the number one, I have enough time to do what's important.
You have enough time to do what's important for you. Well, we don't have enough time. The nice thing is that we value time, right? We can all agree that time's valuable. So how do we take the time we have and make the most of it? Right?
Time you have is valuable.
Yeah.
Correct. Like when you come to the conclusion that we don't have enough time, you realize how valuable time is. That's sort of the positive in that is your realization of, yes, time is a huge commodity that we need to think about in our schools.
These are all implementation challenges, by the way. So it's particularly from an administrative level. When you start to get these issues, something doesn't work, well, at least we understand how it should work, right? So now we have to look for why isn't it working? Is it because we don't understand how it works, really? Is it because we're missing parts that it doesn't work? Is it a time issue? Do we try to rush it? So these are not necessarily have to be showstoppers, but oftentimes we do let them be showstoppers. I saw another hand somewhere. Any other ones? I already kind of hit you can't do it all. But what can we do? What do we know we can do? So that's reframing. Instead of taking the negative approach to it, it's taking the positive. Here's secret number 3. So, okay, we're trying to get more and more concrete as we go along here. Everybody needs anchors. So, and everybody needs 2 anchors, internal and external anchors. So a clear internal goal. So we're going to talk about what's important for implementation for a building or for a school. We talked about this a second ago. Can we try new things, right? If we have a clear internal goal with an understanding of the priorities and the criteria for success, then we know the purpose, outcome, and time frame that we can work with. Okay? So many people, I remember myself, I remember my first year teaching. I had no clue what the goal was. The goal was the book. I was given a book. Chapter, whatever, start at the beginning and somehow get to the back. That was the goal. Okay? And that was everybody's goal, so I guess I would say it was a clearer goal. I understood the priority, the book, and the criteria was front to back. But that did not align, really, it didn't align to why I was teaching. There was no happiness connection there. And it actually became a stone in my shoe. I actually got out of there. I went someplace else. So the foundations are right. Feedback from others and external sources. So you need external sources to guide and motivate action and to evaluate decisions. What should I do? So you can only get so far with what you know. You don't know what you don't know. But the problem is that when you try something new, you need that internal, you need really 90% internal and 10% external. Because that way there, when the data comes back and it's not what you were hoping, right? It's not baby out with the bathwater. It's how do we move it forward, right? What does this mean about what we tried? Is it just because we're implementing something new and there's a learning curve? You know, just because we test every year doesn't mean that everything happens exactly in 9 months. Maybe it takes 12 months. Here's the big dilemma. And you can appreciate this in Massachusetts. A local control model gives DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, an external response pattern. They won't answer questions like, what should I do? So they set the frameworks. They say, you go to them and say, how do I do this? How do I do it? I want to do it. How do I do it? They say, it's up to you. And then on the other side, the presence of DESE regulations gives districts an external mode of change. So districts say to the DESE, they really focus on it, what should I do? So you've got a district saying, what should we do? And you've got a governing body saying, whatever you want. So what comes out of this are talks like, we don't know. What do you want us to change? We don't mind what you change. What do you want to change? And around and around and around it goes. So you can see why it's so important when you come back to the classroom, in the building, in the district, that internal frame of reference is where it all comes from. You're not going to get that from anybody else. And that's why a lot of the school takeover things, they don't work. Some do, very few. And the chance of it sticking really is very minimal. So the takeaway here is focus on peers and implementation. So the culture matters, team mission and leadership message, considering the lens that we're viewing the issues and problems that we're having, and be aware that there's this internal and external frame of reference. Okay. Challenges are going to be a part of things, so reframing on the positive, because that's what actually starts to define the culture of the building. And the most successful schools develop a strong team internal frame of reference and use that external reference, a little bit of it, to help create the change over time. Kind of pivot a little bit.
And I think back to, in one of our earlier sessions, we talked about the MCAS, and there was a slide up there we showed, I think, for the last 4 or 5 years, science, technology, engineering, and math, right? And we showed the MCAS scores as a state. The needle has not moved. Past 5 years, 5th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, the percentages are the same. Needs improvement, wanting, advanced, proficient. For the past 5 years, it hasn't moved. So that tells us, as educators, that maybe the frame that we're looking at and the way that we're doing this, it's not working as productive, because you can account for those. Maybe one town went up, one town went down, another town went down, another town went up. But at the end of the day, if you pull back on the state, the scores literally haven't moved if we just look at it from a science, technology, engineering, and math perspective, 5th, 8th, and 10th grade. And so then you think like, yeah, maybe we should be innovating. Maybe we should be trying something a little bit different. Maybe we should be putting happiness before success. Maybe we do need to change our lesson design and try something new, because the scores have literally not moved. And you can't tell me with over the course of that 5 years, people haven't tried new stuff. So we do need to make those opportunities for folks to be able to implement in a different manner and see if we can get the needle to move in some way. So, the vomit bag. Remember I told you about a vomit bag? So, Cain. We met Cain. We talked about Cain. Cain and the gentleman that came into his father's auto parts store to buy a hubcap, right? His whole world is blown up, as we know. So he took Cain on a trip. They went somewhere across the country to another part of the United States, for Cain to talk to a group of teachers about what he's been doing and so on and so forth. On the way back to L.A., his friend, the documentarian, the filmmaker who was buying the hubcap, who has really helped to bring exposure to Cain and what he's doing, turned to Cain and he said, Cain, what have you learned? What have you learned so far in this process? In the vomit bag here, this is the Air France. It was in France, I guess. It wasn't the United States. He went over to France. The Air France vomit bag, they had nothing to write on, so they pulled the vomit bag out, and Cain pulled a pen out, and he wrote down, these are the things I learned. You can see at the top there it says, what did Cain learn? And so in Cain's experience, this is what he's learned so far, that you have to be nice to customers, do a business that is fun, do not give up, underlined, circled, highlighted, right? Start with what you have and use recycled stuff, right? He used cardboard. I love number 4. Start with what you have. I love it. And here's what you have. And Sue, you talked about this, I think, or Eileen talked about this. You have in front of you every single day naturally curious and creative kids who exhaust their supply of curiosity and creativity at the end of the day, and they come in the next day with a brand new, fully stocked supply of creativity and wonder and curiosity. You have that. It exists. You don't have to go to the store and buy it. You don't have to go to Amazon, Teacher's Pet, any of those places that we all travel a million times to over the course of a year to do all these things. You have that in front of you every single day. And I love that message from Cain of start with what you have. He had cardboard and tape and scissors and imagination and wonder. It doesn't cost any money to tap into that creativity and wonder of the kids. The other one I love, and I love them all, is do not give up. I think I quoted this to you before, but Angela Duckworth, she's got some great work that she's doing. If you ever get a chance to Google or YouTube Angela Duckworth, resiliency is a better predictor of success than IQ. Future success, resiliency. She calls it grit, G-R-I-T. People who are gritty, people who have grit and who are resilient will be more successful than people that necessarily have a higher IQ. And she's done studies and has proven this, and this is a lot of great stuff online, and if you Google Angela Duckworth, you'll come up with this. But that is so true as well. There can be times in education that I think it feels like it's just piling on. Here's another shovel full of stuff for you to deal with, another shovel full of stuff for you to deal with, and I think education can sometimes feel that way. The folks who are standing after all those shovelfuls, right, will be the ones that find the success. There's a great moral, whatever you call it, what do you call those things? Parable? Is that the word? I forget what it's called. Proverb kind of a thing, of a farmer that had a donkey, right? And the donkey was getting old, and he didn't feel the donkey was very useful anymore, and he thought, you know what, it's going to cost me to get rid of this donkey. So he dug this hole in the ground for the donkey, and he put the donkey in the hole, and he was just going to bury it, because the donkey was no longer valuable to him. So he was just going to bury the donkey. And so the farmer would take a shovel full of dirt and throw it in, and the donkey started to get a little panicky, like, oh, wait a minute here, this is a little unnerving. And then the donkey realized, if I just shake off the dirt, it has to pile underneath me. And the farmer would throw another one in, and he would shake off the dirt, and the pile would grow underneath him. And as the farmer continued to pile dirt in, the donkey rose back to the top and walked out of the hole, right? And I love that story because I think oftentimes we can feel that way. I think the state of affairs can sometimes make us feel that way. And the folks who are able to shake off the dirt and not give up and continue to apply that happiness advantage and continue to think about how you implement, how you design, and be thoughtful in those things, I think those are the folks that will be able to live sort of by Keynes' credo here. And you can see how this applies to a classroom, right? Could we have written that for a classroom? Sure. Could you have written it for a school? Sure. Could you have written that for a school district? Absolutely. So I just love this message. He's probably 8 or 9 years old now. And here is this child that gives us this great message from the Air France flight home. Start with what you have and do not give up. So that's sort of secret number 4, right? We talk about sort of these implementation things. What are some things that we can do when we implement that don't have money necessarily associated with them or costs or resources? You have naturally curious students in front of you. You have instructional authority within your classroom. We talked about this. You get to decide the how. You get to figure out the gentleman in the back there from Salem, you talked about when you get to design your lesson plans, right? You have that instructional authority. You get excited about that. You're thinking about, what can I do when I design this lesson for the kids? Knowing that when I design this lesson, I will engage the kids in a certain manner. You have a classroom. Francis, talk about a trash can in a bathroom.
Yeah, so, it's kind of interesting. There's your resources. When you think of what goes into the trash can and the recycling bin, you can do amazing things. And actually, I remember as a teacher myself, that's how I started. And I actually got kind of sick of it, so then that's how I ended up with a company that, eliminated the need for trash cans. But the reality is that there's a lot of great stuff in there. You know how you can teach the water cycle with water bottles? You can make tornadoes out of water bottles. You can make cars out of shims and bottle caps. And you can do balancing experiments with straws and, any little piece of anything bendable and some little ball of anything with mass, old tinfoil. All these sort of things. I mean, it pushes your creativity for sure. But the thing is that, again, it's in how you're designing your lessons and what you're really focusing on. If the lack of resources is the focus, and that's the disabler, then you're never going to have the resources to do what you need to do. And I'm not saying that there are not limits, and I'm not saying that we should all jump in the dumpster when we get home. But the reality is trash can. A classroom is space. When you think about starting a company, one of the biggest barriers to starting a company is paying for your space. to start with. Signing a 5-year lease for your space is huge. You've got space. You've got the kids. And guess what? You're the boss. And that might be a little bit debatable. I mean, I know that you got people over you, right? You got the kids under you. I don't know if they're in control or I'm in control, but you've got that. The trash can, the recycling program, all these sort of things, that's some resources to start with. What does a bathroom have to do with it? Well, guess what? If you're going to wait around for some kind of science lab where you're going to have sinks and hot water and all this sort of stuff, it costs about $500,000 to build the average black table science lab. You know what? You don't need it. You don't need it at all. Because you know what? You can get hot water, cold water. You can get rid of it all. Paper towels are always helpful. You have all these sort of things right there. Every school has classrooms, trash cans, well, maybe not. That's why I didn't write recycle bins up there, because I knew people would say, we don't have recycle bins. Trash cans and bathrooms and teachers and kids. And you can go really far with all these things for all your basic standards, especially at an elementary level. So that's what this is.
And it does engage you at a higher level to get there. But when you think about the barriers to success or happiness or whatever the case may be, we can kind of knock some of those barriers down because you can start with what you have. Again, Kane built an entire arcade out of cardboard and tape and started a revolution. Started an absolute revolution in terms of the number of people who were interested in what he was doing and why he was doing it, and kids building different things. Yes?
Not only just what you have, but you've got this network of kids and families. So if you're doing tornado in a bottle and you need 2-liter bottles, well, you put out a note, collect 2-liter bottles to all the kids bring them in, and you don't even have to jump in the dumpster yourself.
Absolutely.
And I think another point to bring up here too is that you just might say, well, where's the technology? I'm not going to find technology in the trash can. Maybe in some communities you would, but the reality is that all of these elements is learning together. It's doing together. It's all of those things. All the happiness piece, the lens piece, all of that can come together with these elements. And the technology, the role of technology is simply to help you do what you're already doing better. That's it. You're reading, you're acquiring knowledge, you're doing these sort of things. Instead of reading it in a book, you maybe read it on a tablet. You do these sort of things. It makes it lighter. It somehow makes it quicker. It maybe enhances it in some way. It's just enhancing. And the way I always try to keep that in the back of my mind, too, is, and again, technology, the definition of technology is technology solves a problem. So many people go out. Somebody asked at a board I was on, they said, we just bought, if we buy iPads, can we call ourselves a 21st century school? And I said, well, in Massachusetts, you probably can, but it probably just, it doesn't mean anything. It's not doing anything. And I remember when I was teaching, I'll never forget, the student was having a terrible day. Normally nice guy. Was just being a real pain. His class was over, and one of the girls came up and said, so-and-so is really being mean. He's saying all these mean things, and blah, blah, blah. And said, so we pulled him aside and said, so what's going on? And the student just completely broke down, crying, almost wailing. And he said, I'm sorry, I'm so angry. My parents are getting a divorce, and I just don't know, in a very mature sort of way to say, I just don't know what to do. So when I think about it, those are the sort of things technology, you can sit a student in front of a computer and you can take a computerized test and you can do all these sort of things. Computers will never handle divorce. They'll never handle homelessness or abuse or all the sort of things that come to us in our classes. But when you start with the basics and you all get involved in doing something together and you have this focus and you have this lens and you move it forward and you use the technology for what it's good for, but you recognize, and that's, I think, what gets lost in the discourse is that, that's what we handle very well. So keeping that in mind, because technology isn't on this list. And what we are all here for what is a practice? What is a process? How are they different?
Right. So group questions in terms of kind of tying this back to science and technology, engineering, and math, and how do we start to make this happen? Francis talked about the companies that succeed are the ones who come up with better practices and processes for things. And you think about the practices and processes for the things that currently exist in your school. There are practices and processes for science, and there are practices and processes for engineering. And if we can get kids to think in this way, by using with what we have and going with what we know, you'll start to see this shift in your classroom. So what is a practice? What is a process? How are they different? And for time's sake, we're going to skip this slide and roll into the next one. We're going to tell you what a practice and a process is because we want to make sure we get through the information that we want to get through with you today. And so a STEM practice is how STEM knowledge and technology is developed. It's not just a content, it's not just skill. A practice applies skills specific to a content discipline, okay? So practices are these sort of individual things that occur and that you do repeatedly until you become successful at them. So within our NRC, we talked about the National Research Council. We've talked about these in the last 2 sessions. These exist. So this is important for you to know, particularly when next generation science standards come out. You have the standards for mathematical practice in math as part of the Common Core Math. So the state departments of education are starting to identify practices that kids should engage in math. These are important practices that they engage in. There are also practices for science. And the practices for science is understanding how scientific knowledge develops, understanding the work of engineers. Knowledge is more meaningful. Recognize the work of scientists and see science and engineering can contribute to meeting many of the major challenges that confront society today. So this is their rationale behind these practices. And then they have these 8 practices that they've listed, okay? And these 8 practices, if you look at them, they so connect to higher order thinking. You've got asking questions for science, developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations, analyzing and interpreting data, using mathematical and computational thinking, constructing explanations, engaging in arguments, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. These are the practices that have been deemed important for college and career readiness. And that's a big part of the Common Core, college and career readiness. We know this.
For K-12.
Yes, these are absolutely K-12. These are the K-12 practices that are part of the science standards that are happening at the national level and from the National Research Council. So getting our students to engage in these practices in our classroom is a very, very, very important next step of how you design and implement and teach science, technology, engineering in your classrooms, here elementary, K-5, K-6, but certainly K-12.
And so the message here, as we look at the next few slides, is, well, these are all STEM practices, and they're going to be part of the next iteration of MAS frameworks. It's not good enough to just teach engaging argument from evidence. So we can give kids a bunch of evidence and have them argue. No, have them defend or come up with an explanation. There's actually processes behind it. So in the companies you'll see today, they all have practices, but these practices form processes. So let's take a look at the next slide. A process is practices in order, and in STEM, it's specifically to inquire or solve a problem, so to ask questions or to solve problems, okay? That ordered practices is what forms the process. The reason there's a focus on the processes is that is the methodology or the path to extending science and engineering knowledge. So it's not just a question, it's not just a problem. You can pose a question to the students, you can pose a problem to the students, but that's not enough, okay? And the thing is that, and this is be very, very clear with the companies that you see today, it's not optional for success. You don't get to follow the process if you want to, if you think it's okay. You don't get to skip practices because it affects the outcomes, okay? And it doesn't mean that it's an assembly line, it means it's an actual intentional way of going about using processes to identify what particular solution is best or is the correct hypothesis. So let's look at where we've seen these before.
So think about this. In your classrooms, and we're familiar with writing. There are writing practices that take place in our classroom. Practices in writing include ideas, organization, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, conventions, presentation, right? And when we put these into a process, That's important. We don't start by editing, what Francis was saying. You can't reorder things a certain way. There's a specific process that you follow. You have a fire drill process in your school. You have a process for dismissal in your school. When the bell rings, hopefully, it's not just, see you later, and everyone just goes out and there's no order and it's just total chaos.
And if you skip it,
right.
If you skip a step, what happens if you don't revise and edit? Does that affect the product? And I don't mean the product as they're all the same, right? Everybody could be writing something different. But the final piece will be affected.
And it's not optional. I love that what Francis just said about that. When you go to the company visits today, if they're separated on molecule, they don't say, you know what, it's Tuesday, I don't feel like doing that step today. So they probably won't have a job very long, right? And whatever their product is, whatever it is they're selling, they're not going to be able to sell anymore because it's now missing this important thing. So we have processes and practices currently in our schools all over the place. We're connecting this to science. We educators, it's incumbent upon us to start to establish these practices, putting them in the right order, and developing these processes in our science, technology, and engineering classes. We've talked about math as sort of the toolbox of science, technology, or math is the language of science, technology, engineering. So what is the ordering of these practices? What does it look like? So yeah, we have a writing process. And so secret number 5 is we have students practice as scientists and engineers. That's important. We can't hope that science will occur. What is that quote? Hope is not a strategy, right? We can't hope that these things will occur. We actually have to practice them. And we can practice them with what we have, using recycled materials. You don't need the $500,000 science lab. That's why I'm trying to connect all these things for you. Happiness matters. All those other cigarettes along the way matter, right? And so students identify, develop, and execute STEM practices. Students create, evaluate, analyze higher order thinking, their experiments. Students own and apply scientific and engineering processes. Francis, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so the thing is that just like you wouldn't focus only on vocabulary, just like you wouldn't focus only on editing, just like you wouldn't focus only on one thing, the students actually have to have an understanding of the process, use the practices, understand the process, apply the process, and that's how writing improves. And that's how real writing skills develop and ability, capacity develops. And so real scientists, real engineers don't just learn the definition of a sedimentary rock. They don't just do what they're told to do. You know, is it blue, is it black, whatever, match it to the sheet. That's not science, that's not engineering, that's something else. Okay, that's fact memorization. And it doesn't produce really great outcomes. And so if we give the students the ownership, we're meeting, and as you give the students the ownership, as they're applying these things, we're developing the higher order thinking skills, but we're also meeting their needs for happiness too, because they want to do it. They want the permission to do that. And so it's part of that engagement that we all are striving for. If we can engage the students in something that's more holistic, then their understanding of science and engineering is more holistic, and then the results actually reflect that. So if you go to the next slide.
Yeah, and just one more thing on that. You made me think of something. When we talk about this happiness advantage, you have to pull back. This is not just your classroom, so to speak. Pull back, and this is going to sound a little dramatic, and I don't mean it to sound that way, but pull back on the kid's life. Our first session, we sat here and we talked about the workforce in this state and in this country is very much STEM related. STEM unemployment was lower than regular unemployment. People that have STEM jobs and work in those STEM fields, and that field is going to grow, and they'll earn more money, and we know that that's where the workforce is. 7-year-olds matter to the workforce. I know that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but the sooner we can start to instill these things in our kids and build that foundation, and they get up into the middle of high school and they're taking some more advanced math and science classes because you have laid the foundation for them, you are setting them up for their life. You're setting them up for their career. You really are, and I know that sounds, I teach this grade or that grade, and that's like 30 years down the road. It is true. That's the reason for these STEM site visits, because the turning of the wrench that you do in 2nd grade and 3rd grade and 4th grade has a major effect of when that car rolls off the line, so to speak, metaphorically, at the end. And you'll see that importance today in these STEM visits.
So I think we're going to take maybe a couple minutes to do
Yeah.
this. So in your bag, you have some blue cards. And on the blue cards are all of each one has a single NRC STEM practice on it. So National Research Council practice. So they're all STEM practices. Okay. With somebody near you, and don't get your cards all mixed up, see if you can order them into the scientific process. See if you can order them into the scientific process.
So think of like a writing process that you use in writing. How would you take these scientific practices and put them into some sort of a process? What would be a scientific process in the ordering of these practices?
Where do they belong in that scientific process? So if you again think about the writing practices, the writing process, these are the STEM practices. What's the science? Okay, so let's take a look. This is sometimes people refer to it as scientific method or scientific process. In science, science is knowledge from experimentation. New knowledge from experimentation. You always start with a question. So practice number 1 is why it says question science in parentheses. Okay. Number 2, research. In research, you're doing an investigation to figure out what's known and if that question has been answered before. So this actually involves, in some elements, practices 3, 4, 5, and 8, potentially. Hypothesis, the third step in the scientific process. A hypothesis is what you formulated a potential answer to the question, something that you're going to test with an experiment. That's number 6 from the cards that you have.
And what is number 6? Can someone just read that out loud? Nice and loud.
You're constructing an explanation that you will test to see whether it is true or false or inconclusive. You may say supported or unsupported. Summarizing the experiment. That's 2 or 3. Or not 2 or 3, but 2 and 3. I can pull up the slide. Right. Developing and using models, planning and carrying out investigations. So as you're summarizing your experiment at a high level, you're developing a model for how you're going to test that hypothesis. At a high level, you're planning your investigation. So we talk about inquiry. Inquiry is just an investigation. Inquiry process is an investigative process. The scientific method is the process for investigating questions. Engineering design process is the process for solving problems. The inquiry process for solving problems, they're different. Okay. Number 5, procedure and materials. 2, 5, and 8. Okay. Number 2, developing and using a model. 5, using mathematics and computational thinking. 8, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. You're developing a model for what you need in this experiment. Quantities, that's the mathematics. Computational thinking, how much, if I do this for 3 trials, do I need? 8, obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. Procedure, materials, it's all information about what you need to accomplish this experiment in a specific way. Scientific diagram, again, 2, 3, and 8. Data table, so the data you collect, it's about number 8, obtaining, evaluating, communicating information, but 2, 3, 4, and 5, depending on how you view the data table and how you apply it, can involve all of those practices as well. Number 8, conclusion, using your hypothesis and your data and forming an argument about whether it's true, false, or inconclusive, or if you are using a different word, so be it. Those use skills 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So the thing is that while these practices are ordered, they are also recurring. But this methodology is ushering a student from, just like in the writing process, from a question to a conclusion that's evidence-based. Okay?
So, Francis, could you give us a practical? Because this,
Yeah.
I might sit here and go, wow, that's big. I know you told me I'll start with what I have, and I'll do all these things.
Right.
And I'll do all this, but boy, that seems like a big thing and a tall order for me to undertake.
Sure.
Can you give us with what I have?
Sure. So I went
practical
dumpster
example of
diving.
that?
So I went dumpster diving, and it's after Hanukkah, so I found some candles, and I had some jars and some other things. And I had a question of, does fire need oxygen? And I did some research, and I really have no access to resources, so I had no answer to this question. My hypothesis was that fire needs oxygen. I could come up with an experiment with my candles and my jars. And so what I did was I said I need one candle. I decided to get one of 3 different size jars. And I developed a procedure where I would light the candle. I'd place the small jar over the top, and I would time how long it took the candle to go out if it went out at all. And I would repeat that process 3 more times, and each time I repeated that process, I did it with a different size jar. And then I looked at the data, and I made a scientific diagram of how this procedure comes together. And then I looked at the data, because I did the experiment, and I found that the larger the jar was, the longer the candle burned. So not only did the oxygen matter, or I think it was oxygen, maybe we need to go back and verify that it was oxygen and not carbon dioxide or something, but the size of the jar mattered. So I knew that there was more oxygen in the larger jar than the smaller jar, and the candle remained constant. And in my conclusion, I could restate my hypothesis that oxygen is required, fire requires oxygen to burn. And I know that, and in our experiment, I know that this is true because when placing a jar over the candle exhausted its supply of oxygen, but also as I changed the size of the jars, I found that I changed the amount of time that the candle was able to burn, and actually it increased as the size of the jar increased. So all of that just from something I could have found kind of in my neighborhood trash.
So by doing that, by using what he had, right, he was able to, and that was real simple. That was basic. That was not, let's split an atom, right? That was real basic. And he integrated, if you look at your practices, 1, 3, 4, all the different practices were implemented along the way, which we know we need to implement. Now here's the important message. Yes, the content of children knowing that fire needs oxygen to burn is important. That's important. That's an important thing for them to know along the way. What's more important is that they followed a practice and a procedure. You're developing in their minds a way of thinking. That's the important part of this. So when you say, like, well, really, do they really need to know that candle in a fire? Like, why am I spending my time on that? Like, they can probably get that on Google. What they can't get on Google is that you have to attack a problem in a sequential methodology. And that methodology has been defined for us as a process for us. We don't want to skip steps in that process, but they'll now take that way of thinking. You're not just giving them content, you're giving them a way of thinking. And that's the important message you need to take from today. And so they'll take that way of thinking and they'll apply it to other situations in life. You were going to hear ad nauseum today at these site visits that that's what's important. Tell the duck and the boy fishing story real quick.
Yeah, so real quick, boy and duck story. So I'm fortunate, my office has a window. The window overlooks a little canal. And in the canal, there's a dock. And in the summertime, there's always, actually it's kind of weird in the wintertime too, there's ducks and swans and things like this around. And the guy who works on the dock, someone had left some bread behind. He threw it in the water one day. And the bread spread out, and the tide started to go out, and then the water went down underneath the dock through this little opening, and all the ducks were on the other side of the opening fighting with each other to get the bread. And I thought about it, and I was like, this is crazy. All these ducks are fighting over this little bit of bread coming through the hole. If they just got up and on the other side, the bread is all over the place. It'd be a free-for-all. So I thought, that's interesting. Well, I guess, again, that's why we're not ducks, right? The ducks didn't know to get over. Well, Later on, I saw a little boy, and I've seen this boy before, and he does this, it just sort of like stuck with me. Jumped off the parents' boat, got on the dock, took his fishing rod, has his whole life jacket on and everything, and he goes fishing. And he stood there for about an hour, and he took his fishing rod, and he'd cast it out, and he'd reel it back as fast as he can, every single time. Cast it out as hard as he could, reel it back as fast as he could. He didn't catch anything. And maybe he wondered why, but I could see from his behavior that he had no process to solve his problem. Right? Because if he would have been thinking scientifically about trying to catch fish, he would have thrown it out there and maybe reeled it in slower or faster, or maybe not thrown it out as hard, or maybe thrown it out in a different place. And he would have been informally collecting data on his method for trying to catch fish. And his hypothesis testing would have recurred over and over again. Is it how I'm throwing it? Is it what I'm using for bait? Is it this? Is it that? And he would have been able to come to a conclusion that would have actually helped him answer the question. So in that scenario, when I think about the ducks being stuck and that student being stuck, the student has certainly the capability of using the process. And I mean, this little guy was like 8. We see 8-year-olds do this all the time. So
that's the thing. So then that's the message, is that you're giving kids ways to think scientifically. And when you teach them this, it will transcend science, technology, and engineering and impact other parts of their life. And they'll begin to look at things in a scientific manner and test a hypothesis and break it down and try something new. And that's the skill that they need as they make their way through the grade. So yes, knowing that a candle in fire needs oxygen to burn, that's important. That probably won't be built on too much as they get through the grades. What will be built on is that there's a practice and a process to things. That's so crucial, and that's what you're giving them. So when you say, like, I don't have time to teach science, and we know all the reasons for it, and we know all that stuff, but you have to peel it back to, start with what you have, the happiness advantage, all the things that we talked about, you're giving them a way of thinking. That way of thinking will change their life. It will change their life. The sooner we can give them this new way of thinking, they'll approach problems in a different manner. And it's the same thing for engineering. We're not going to have time to go through the engineering design process, but there's a design process for engineering as well. You have a scientific method that you use, and there's an engineering design process that you use when you're trying to engineer something.
And you may say, so just kind of quickly looking at this, and if you're familiar with like EIE or something like that, this is unpacked. This is unpacked things like if you tell a student to plan, I mean, who knows what that involves. But if you can unpack what it means to plan, now we know what that involves. So engineers solve problems, right? The engineers you meet today will all be solving problems, different problems, expensive problems, doing research, right? How has that problem been solved before? What materials are used to solve it? Survey available materials. What is it I have to work with? What's within the budget? What's within the budget of what people can afford to pay for this solution? Identify possible solutions. Knowing what's within the realm of materials and their properties and their everything, what are some potential or probable ways of solving this problem? Diagram and build prototypes. So as you decide, you look at all the possible solutions, you pick one, and you diagram it. You make a plan. What does it look like? Okay, you can see, again, the numbers that are next to these are all of those STEM practices. Okay? You build that prototype, you test it, so you simulate its use. And you use that testing process to gather data, and then you come to another conclusion about whether you would refine that prototype or whether you would replicate it. And it's interesting because all of the industry you're going to has R&D centers. And this is what they do all the time. And somebody who works in one of those centers recently told me that their technology has gotten as good as it can get because atoms don't get any smaller. We still need atoms. And so now they're trying to figure out how to use their technology on other things. And they've been using it on very, very different things. And he said to me, guess what? I just invented yesterday. I invented something, a superconductor, that will be able to stop brownouts around the world. Imagine that.
Stop what?
Brownouts.
Oh, brownouts.
Power shortages. Because the superconductor, it also can be used as a supercapacitor. And so that just came from the problem of needing to be able to use the technology for something else. and coming up with different ways that the science concepts are used. And so the connection is that taking the scientific knowledge and the product, they were able to solve a new problem.
So if I'm sitting here and the people up here are telling me, okay, I get it. I'm going to start with what I have. I'm going to think about the happiness advantage, and I am going to understand that I'm not just teaching the content, I'm teaching a process, and that process is teaching a way of thinking that will apply to other parts of these students' lives, right? So I get that, and I sit here and I say to you, so Francis, when do I use a scientific method and when do I use engineering design? Like so if it's a candle, I use scientific method, but if I want to build a robot, it's engineering? What's the difference?
No, not always. So here's the difference. C question, C problem, that's the difference, right there. The difference is if you're trying to answer a question, that's science. If you're trying to solve a problem, that's engineering. That's why the NRC wrote that into the practices. So it's unmistakable. And you can see the processes are different. Ignore the numbers. Those numbers are just the practices and where they fall. But you can see, you start with a question over here, you start with a problem over here. You do research, and then it changes completely. Over here, you go to that hypothesis, what you think. You don't say think, but it's what you're going to test. The explanation you've constructed that you're going to test. Over here, you're looking at what's available. And then you're trying to figure out from what's available what might be a possible solution. So in the case of my friend, what was available was their machines, atoms, and some other things. How could they use it to develop a solution? And so he came up with this other thing. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. Question and problem. And then just like the practices, like you see all these numbers next to it, those practices are showing up. They're the same practices, but they're showing up in different places and in different arrangements all over the place. So if you just make the step to practices, that's good, but it's not all the way. If you take the practices and then you step to the processes, now we're into the thinking. Now we're into the problem solving. Now we're into the question answering. And that's the real skill. And I was talking to a CEO of a company that makes the active ingredients for generic drugs. And he said to me, and I said, we'd really love you to come and speak at this event. And he said, I'd love to. He's like, because I would like more PhDs who can think. And what he meant was, right here, I want more PhDs that understand these processes and can use them.
Think about how that would help, and I hate to even make this connection, how that would help on MCAS. If kids are thinking a certain way, if they have a certain way of thinking and deducing and deducting and coming to some sort of a conclusion, if they come to a problem that maybe they're a little bit stuck on, right? They now have a thought process. I can't stress this enough. You're literally changing their lives by teaching them how to think this way, because it will apply to myriad other parts of their life. There's no question about it. And they'll be able to access those different subjects that they need to access and pursue careers that will be very successful for them. So I like that. So scientific method I use when I want to answer a question, identify engineering design when I want to identify a problem. Perfect.
And so you can have questions about fires or you can have problems with fires. And those would be two different. Not that I'm not recommending go back with your third graders and start fires. Oh, the third, this is one of the final secrets. Have faith your students can do it. And have faith you can do it. Because when you look at these processes, you say, oh, wow, that's really new and different. That's kind of complex. You look at the practices, you may have the same feeling. But they can do it, and you can do it.
Start small, start simple, start with the basics. There's a bookmark. I'll give you a cheat sheet. There's a bookmark in your green bag. And that bookmark has the scientific method and the engineering design process on it, along with the practices. Okay? So he gave you a little cheat sheet to tape to your desk, put in your favorite book, tape it to your iPad if you read on an e-reader. List of inquiry lesson cigarettes. So these are the 7 things that we've talked about today. We talked about that happiness matters. Put happiness before success. Don't put happiness after success. The lens makes a difference. You need an anchor. Start doing STEM with what you have. Have students practice as scientists and engineers. Use the processes. And have faith that your students can do it, because they can. We've seen it. We've seen kindergarten kids, preschool kids, engaging in some of the basics of this, the real basics. but you're laying that foundation brick by brick. So what can you do? If you're a district administrator, you can promote a principal culture that focuses on the positive, balance internal and external anchors, invest in science and engineering resources to support and empower educators, encourage risk-taking, act as a coach. If you're a principal, promote that positive culture, give teachers the permission to try new things. We just talked about that earlier. Reframe and challenge, start with what you have, seek the best support, encourage risk-taking. If you're a teacher, teach to happiness, use that positive lens, use what you have, design lessons that regularly use the processes, have students own practice and processes, have faith in your students. So there are very simple, low-cost things we can do. If you take nothing from today, take this. There are practices in sciences. There are practices for engineering. How you order those practices determines the process. The quicker we can get kids to teach in learn in a process-oriented manner, you will see real results in your classroom. There's no question about it. The schools and the classrooms that figure this out sooner are going to be the schools and the classrooms that are more successful sooner. Businesses are constantly trying to tweak their processes to make them better. You do it as a classroom teacher. As a classroom teacher first year, the process that I had for doing something was way better the third year because I learned along the way. But the sooner we can get kids to think in this manner, the better off we'll be.
And to be really concrete, too, looking back at these, you might say, well, what's the takeaway? What can I go and actually implement in my classroom? You can implement all those secrets. They don't cost anything. When you go back and look at your lesson plans, where do they fit here?
Right.
Because if they don't, that's where the changes need to happen. And if you go through your lesson plan, it says, have the students do this, have the students do that, have the students do this, have the students do that. And if you are identifying with that person, if you were here last time, that was kind of in the middle, going around, and students are doing what they're told to do at the stations, and the teacher's going around and kind of turning the wheel, that's not this. Okay? That's the change that needs to happen. And that fire example is actually an example I took from a kindergarten teacher in New Hampshire who said, we're learning about fire. We put jars over the candle. And just one jar, actually. She said, but I don't see how that fits here. I said, well, actually, here's how it can fit. So not necessarily what you're doing is, it's not bad. Okay, it's not wrong. But now you know maybe something that you didn't know. And now how do you take what you know and bring it back and look for these things? That's the big takeaway for me here.
Yeah. Just show of hands. Is this making sense? Is it or nodding of a head? Yeah? Okay, fine. Okay, good.